In the farthest corner of the cold metal cages at Montana Haven Shelter, where the autumn winds seep through every crack in the walls, there lies an old figure curled up in a thin blanket. His name is Duke, a short, solid name, once called out with pride under command. But now it is nothing more than a faded sign hanging in front of his cage, a sad reminder that someone once called him with love, and then silently let him go. Duke is a German shepherd who has spent a full 19 years of his life in service, with absolute loyalty. At that age, he wasn't just old, he was quietly old, his bones aching under the weight of memories that made it hard for him to rise. His back was hunched, his once thick, shiny coat now tangled and falling out in patches, scorched like areas of burned land. His eyes were cloudy, not entirely because of age, but perhaps because he hadn't seen anything worth watching in a long time. For the 6 months since he was brought to the shelter, Duke had never once stepped out of that corner of the cage. People came, they passed by, petting the playful puppies wagging their tails. They liked the fresh, eager, promising faces. But Duke, he only had silence. No barking, no joy, no anger. Just lying there, as though he was waiting for himself to fade away. But what caught the attention of the shelter staff wasn't Duke's stillness. It was something strange that they couldn't explain. Every time night fell, if the distant sound of a siren from an ambulance or police car echoed through the air, Duke immediately stood up. It wasn't the panic of an old dog or a reflexive startle. He would straighten up, his head lifted high, ears perked towards the sound, his eyes instantly sharp, glowing like a spark flickering in the ashes. It was as though someone had issued an invisible command, and his body, as if reacting to something deeply embedded in his blood, was immediately ready. In those moments, Duke didn't whine, didn't howl, didn't move forward. He simply stood there quietly, waiting as if guarding something sacred. Then, as the sound faded away, he would slowly lie down, retreating into his darkness. Emma, a young volunteer at the shelter, once whispered, "I think he misses his old job, or his old person." But what job? What person? No one knew. In the shelter's logbook, Duke was simply listed as an elderly family dog, unable to be cared for. No special markings, no full medical record, no messages left behind. There was something about Duke that made it hard to look away. Not out of pity, but because something in his presence told you he wasn't just an ordinary dog. Not everyone lives to be 19. Not everyone, whether dog or human, carries within their eyes a fragment of discipline, a trace of vigilance, a sense that something unfinished remains when abandoned to the fullest extent. In the cold of Montana's mountains, where everything is easily forgotten, there is a creature that remains awake every night. Not to survive, but to preserve something lost. But what that was, no one could guess. All they knew was that, where all doors were closing, his eyes still silently gazed into the distance, where his heart believed that someone would return to call his name one last time. The old shelter door creaked softly as Sandra stepped through, a sound as familiar as a long-awaited greeting. But for her, it was also a reminder of memories that had faded, of the days spent volunteering with Jake when she and he cared for the abandoned dogs. 2 years had passed since his death. Sandra hadn't forgotten what she had gone through, but all that time, she had lived in the shadow of her sorrow. The house now felt empty, with no one waiting, no one calling her name. Today, for reasons she couldn't quite explain, an invisible force had drawn her back here. Maybe it was the silence in the empty house, maybe the pain that hadn't yet faded in her heart. But the only thing she knew was that a powerful feeling had driven her back to this place, where she had once given so much love to the unfortunate dogs. She wasn't here to adopt a new dog, not because loneliness was eating her up, but to find a part of the lost memory, a piece of the peaceful days she had once shared with Jake. She wasn't looking for anything, but still, she hoped for a meeting, a trace of the past to feel that she was still alive, that Jake's memory still lingered somewhere in the air. As she walked past the cages, her gaze didn't linger on any particular dog, even though they all looked bright, healthy, and full of life. A few dogs ran up to her, barking happily, wagging their tails, as if looking for attention. The puppies raised their heads, eyes sparkling, hoping someone would take them home. But Sandra didn't pay attention to them. She just passed by, gazing into the distance as if searching for something invisible. Suddenly, a soft, unusual sound made her stop. It wasn't the bark of the playful dogs, nor the sounds of animals wanting attention. This sound was like a low growl, a sense of alertness, but with an underlying pain, as if the animal had no strength left to fight back, but still held a part of it that was strong, refusing to give in. It was the sound of an old warrior standing guard. She turned around and saw, at the end of the row of cages, Duke, the elderly German shepherd, lying silently in the corner of his cage. The dog didn't bark, didn't wag his tail, just simply lay there with cloudy eyes, staring straight at her as if waiting for something. His legs were thin and weak, but still looked ready to stand if needed. A vague sign of readiness, of discipline not yet broken. Sandra's feelings at that moment were indescribable. She couldn't take her eyes off Duke. It seemed like not just an old dog lying there, but a living part of the past from the days she had forgotten. Duke's gaze wasn't one of helplessness, nor one of hopeless longing. He didn't seem happy to see someone, nor did he show any sign of needing care, but his look carried something that made Sandra feel a connection. Just like her, he was waiting for something. Sandra moved closer, slowly, without haste. She bent down, her eyes locked on Duke. That gaze wasn't from a dog. It was from an old friend, a comrade who had stood by her through tough times. The dog didn't react strongly, but didn't shy away either. A silence enveloped them, and at that moment, Sandra could feel the resilience in Duke. Although he was no longer young, although his brightest days were behind him, Duke was still a warrior in spirit, still capable of standing up when needed. "Hello, Duke," Sandra whispered, her voice soft but full of understanding. She didn't know why she said it, but those words seemed like an unspoken connection between two souls, one searching for healing and the other, once a loyal protector, now just a fading figure. Sandra stood there, looking at Duke with a deep feeling. Duke didn't express joy, didn't bark, didn't jump up like the other dogs. He just stared at her, his eyes never leaving hers, as if assessing whether she was the one he had been waiting for. Then, in a moment of silence, Duke slowly lifted his head. A fleeting look, the old eyes meeting Sandra's gaze. She realized something in that look. It wasn't just the gaze of a tired dog, but of an old friend, one who had been waiting for redemption. Not in the body, but in the soul. Duke still had something strong within him, a part that had never given up. Sandra couldn't understand everything at that moment, but she knew Duke wasn't just another abandoned dog. He was a warrior, and warriors never die until they feel their mission is complete. Sandra stood there, her hand gently resting on the cage bar, unable to tear her eyes away from Duke. She felt something unexplainable in his gaze. The dog didn't jump at her, didn't run to wag his tail like the other animals. He only slowly lifted his head, his cloudy eyes suddenly brightening in an instant. That gaze was not one of pleading, not a cry for help, but a scrutinizing, alert look, as though evaluating her every movement, like an old warrior checking if a true comrade had finally returned. That gaze sent a shiver down Sandra's spine, as though a wave of emotion stirred within her. She recalled the mornings in Jake's training room when he stood facing canine dogs, giving commands in silence and seriousness. The sharp, cold eyes of the trainer dogs were always alert, always ready to react to any danger. Sandra had witnessed that look many times when Jake trained his dog, eyes full of preparation, full of fighting instinct, never showing weakness. Duke, despite his age, despite the weariness from years of service, still carried that look, the gaze of one who had lived through battlefields, a person who never revealed fear or helplessness. A sharp look, though dulled by time, but still the indelible instinct of a trained warrior. Sandra couldn't speak. That look was not from an ordinary dog. It was the look of a warrior, of a loyal companion who had lived through dangerous moments, fighting for causes greater than themselves. And now, that gaze was directed at her. Someone unfamiliar. Yet it felt as though she were the one Duke had been waiting for all along. She took a step closer, not in haste, not making any move that could frighten Duke. She wanted to ensure she wasn't just a passing breeze, but a part of his story, a part of the journey Duke had lived through. Sandra gazed deeply into those eyes, where the scars of time and old memories lay hidden. She knew Duke wasn't just a dog who could be loved out of pity. He was a friend, an old warrior, and what he needed wasn't sympathy, but understanding. Sandra sat down, a little closer, closing the distance so it no longer felt like a barrier. She wasn't afraid, no longer feeling strange or anxious. Duke was looking at her, and she realized that at that moment, the crossing of two souls had begun. She didn't know why she chose Duke, didn't know what had made her make this seemingly crazy decision, but when sitting across from him, she felt that she wasn't just there to save a dog. She was here to save herself, to touch a part of the memories, a part of the feelings she had buried for so long. Duke didn't move, but his gaze never left her. Sandra spoke softly. "You're not an ordinary dog, are you?" Her voice was gentle, as if afraid to scare him. Duke didn't respond. There was no movement, but that gaze still brightened, as if he understood every word she spoke, as if he was listening and feeling. A silent gaze, but one that carried a strange connection between two souls. And in that moment, Sandra felt as though she had understood everything. It wasn't that she was saving Duke. It wasn't that he needed her. Both of them needed each other, even if neither spoke it out loud. They were survivors. Old warriors who had lost something important in life, but who kept moving forward, seeking healing in the fragments that remained. Duke's gaze slowly softened a little. Even though he didn't move, didn't bark, or wag his tail, something had changed in that gaze. It was no longer rejection, but empathy and acceptance. He looked at her as if saying, "If you're the one I've been waiting for, I won't stop anymore." Sandra felt that shift in the air. This was not a reckless decision. It was an invisible thread of connection, one that could be felt, never to be broken. The strange feeling in Sandra's heart hadn't faded even after sitting across from Duke. He was no longer an anonymous dog at the shelter, not a mindless creature waiting to die. Duke had become a part of her story, a soul that had risen from the darkness of being forgotten, of abandonment. The dog was no longer just an old dog, but an old warrior, a companion who had dedicated his life to justice. When she stood up and turned to ask Gregory, the shelter owner, about Duke's origins, Sandra felt as if she were stepping into a pit filled with sorrow. She didn't just want to know about Duke's past, but she also wanted to understand why such a loyal creature had been forgotten, left behind as something no longer valuable. There was something in Duke's eyes that made her believe his story wasn't over yet, that he had a past full of bravery that no one knew. "Greg," Sandra spoke, her voice tinged with concern. "Did they say anything about his background?" Gregory leaned against the cage wall, arms crossed over his chest, looking at Duke with a look full of pity. "They said he was a family dog," he began, sighing as if trying to recall every detail. "They raised him since he was a pup, but now he's just a shadow of himself. They said he was too old and no longer useful." He sighed again, then lowered his head, his face showing regret. "Too tired now. No one wants to take in an old dog just to watch him die slowly." Those words fell heavy and cold. Sandra could feel the bitterness in Gregory's story, but what made her feel something deeper was the indifference, the abandonment that those words carried. He wasn't just an abandoned animal. He was a friend, a companion for 19 years. He had lived in love, in unconditional loyalty. But now all that was left was coldness, no trace of an old friend. "But," Sandra asked again, her voice tinged with doubt, "are you sure they didn't say anything else about his past, about his missions, about what he did?" Gregory furrowed his brow, his expression showing slight surprise. "No, Sandra. They just said Duke was a family dog, loyal, and had done good work. But if you're asking about the years before he came here, I don't know. All I know is they didn't need him anymore. He had nothing left to give." Those words hit Sandra's heart like a punch. Duke hadn't just been abandoned by his old family, but his history had been erased. He wasn't just an ordinary dog. He was an old comrade of soldiers, a K9 dog who had lived for a purpose far greater than himself. Duke's story couldn't be so simple. It couldn't just be that he was an old dog left behind because of age. She couldn't stop thinking about the story Duke had lived through, about what he had given and sacrificed. Sandra began to realize where she had seen that look before. That look wasn't from an ordinary dog, but from a warrior who had fought in battles, from a friend who had once fought with everything for his comrades. "Greg," Sandra whispered, "can we learn more about Duke? Can we find out more about his past?" She didn't just want to know Duke's history. She also felt that Duke needed a chance to be known, not to be erased so that his sacrifices would be recognized. Gregory looked at her, his eyes showing surprise at the determination in Sandra's voice. "Actually," he hesitated, "they gave him to us after he stopped serving. He used to be a K9, but he was left without any explanation. We just took him in as a dog that had been abandoned." A K9. That word struck Sandra like a bolt of lightning. Duke had been a warrior, a protector, a teammate who had devoted his life to justice and protection. But now, he was just considered an old dog to be discarded. The memories of his guarding, his protection, his racing through important missions, all of that had been buried, forgotten by the indifference of the people he had been loyal to his whole life. Sandra stood there, silent, her heart filled with emotion. She couldn't let Duke live in this oblivion. He wasn't just an old dog. He was a part of a larger story, a part of a family that had once fought together. Sandra stood silently, her hand still resting lightly on the iron bar of the cage, her feelings too complex to express in words. The stories Gregory had just told her about Duke, the words about abandonment, about his uselessness now, hit her like a massive wave crashing over her mind. Duke, the old dog, once a warrior, was now nothing more than a forgotten memory. The story of his years of service had been erased, leaving behind a creature regarded as an unwanted object, no longer valuable. But Sandra knew, in those eyes, there was still something unspeakable, a part of resilience and loyalty that could never be erased. She looked at Duke, feeling the faintest of his breaths. He still lay there, in the dark corner of his cage, his frail body, his fur tangled. There was no notable response, but the look in his cloudy eyes wasn't one of rejection or indifference. It was a silent gaze, full of contemplation, like an old friend who had seen everything but no longer wished to speak. Sandra bent closer, near the cage. A feeling of tenderness but also resolve rose within her. She called Duke's name, as if searching for some trace still left in his memory. "Duke," she whispered, her voice soft like a passing breeze, hoping not to frighten him. But the silence persisted, an eternal silence like his heart, unresponsive, unmoving. Then suddenly, a sound echoed from a distance, the sound of an ambulance, the long, blaring siren reverberating through the void. Sandra didn't notice it at first. But then, suddenly, Duke seemed to hear something from far away. He stood up quickly, not in haste, not in fear, but as an automatic response, as though he had been trained to react this way for years. He didn't bark, didn't charge forward like other dogs, but simply stared toward the sound of the siren, his ears drooping, his eyes wide open. This wasn't the look of a wild or indifferent dog, but that of a warrior ready to follow orders. His chest expanded, his breath steady but strong, as though the response was deeply ingrained in his body. a sign of readiness. Sandra watched him, stunned. She couldn't believe what she had just seen. Duke, a frail, old dog, no longer able to run or bark as before, could still stand firm with incredible vigilance. It wasn't a reaction of panic or insecurity, but an automatic response, like a soldier who had endured battles, pain, and challenges, and now, though weary, was still ready to stand guard when commanded. Sandra said nothing, only stared at him, her heart filled with astonishment and respect. She felt something very clear at that moment. Duke was not a dog who had outlived his worth, not a creature abandoned. He was a warrior, a loyal friend, and he still had life in him, still had a part of his instinct waiting for an opportunity to live again. "You were trained," Sandra whispered, her voice choking in her throat. She didn't need to ask Gregory anymore, didn't need to search for more answers. Duke's gaze and reaction had given her the only answer she needed to know. He had once been a K9, a warrior in the police force, a protector who never faltered, never surrendered. Even though he no longer had the strength to stand tall, that instinct still lived in him, still existed strongly as everything he had been trained for throughout those long years. Sandra felt a surge of emotion rises within her. Duke was not just an ordinary dog. He was part of memories, part of battles fought, part of a life Sandra had once shared, once walking beside Jake. She didn't just see an old dog. She didn't just see an abandoned animal. She saw a friend, a comrade, a warrior still fighting with himself, not accepting abandonment. The feeling within Sandra became clearer than ever. Duke was still fighting, not for any mission, but for himself. He had not given up, even though his body had drained of strength. He was still ready, simply because he had been trained to always be ready. A soul that would not yield. A warrior who would never abandon his mission. Sandra knew that from that moment on, she couldn't let Duke continue living in oblivion, in that loneliness. He wasn't an old, useless dog. He was a warrior, and he deserved to live like a hero. Sandra stood there, her gaze fixed on Duke, the old dog who had once been a warrior, now just a faded shadow, but still carrying something powerful deep within his eyes. Duke didn't bark, didn't wag his tail, didn't react like the other dogs. But in his eyes, Sandra saw something that had never extinguished. A flame still smoldering, not out of pity, but from resilience, loyalty, and a memory that had never been forgotten. The feeling within Sandra couldn't stop, a powerful urge rising from deep in her heart. She couldn't leave Duke behind any longer. Not because of pity, not from simple compassion, but because she realized that he wasn't an ordinary dog. He was a warrior who had once lived with discipline and loyalty, and now, even though his body had grown weak, his spirit hadn't given up. Duke deserved a peaceful life, not to suffer from being forgotten. Sandra couldn't forget the look in his eyes when the ambulance siren blared. That gaze, though now clouded by age, was still sharp and full of resilience, as if waiting for an order, an opportunity to start again, to continue fighting even though he no longer lived in his old world. She had seen that look in the days with Jake, those eyes, the fiery eyes of old warriors, never giving up, never yielding. But when Sandra turned to look at Gregory, the question about her decision still lingered. He stood there, arms crossed, his eyes full of concern, as if wanting to stop her from making a decision that he knew would be a mistake. "Sandra," Gregory said softly, his voice lowering, "don't get your hopes up. He's disconnected from people now. There's no way to heal him." He sighed, his voice showing clear disappointment. "We've done everything we could, tried taking him to the vet, gave him every opportunity. But now he's stopped living. No one can save him anymore." Gregory's words didn't sway Sandra. She silently looked at Duke, not just as an old dog lying there, but as a warrior who had once lived in his world, who had once protected and sacrificed with all his heart. She knew that what Duke needed wasn't physical healing. What he needed, what he deserved, was understanding and a second chance. Sandra looked at Gregory, then turned back to Duke, her heart firm. "I'm taking him home," she said, her voice resolute and full of determination. "I won't let a warrior die in silence." She didn't know when she had said those words, but once they were spoken, she knew it wasn't just an impulsive decision. It was a choice from the heart, a commitment to herself and Duke. She couldn't abandon a creature who had spent his whole life protecting others, couldn't let him end his life in a cold cage with no one to call his name. She looked at Duke one more time, her gaze filled with resolve. "We'll start over, Duke," she whispered, as though he could hear. "You don't have to end like this. You deserve a better life." Duke didn't react. He still lay there, his eyes beginning to close, but Sandra felt something change in the air, as though a spark of hope had been lit in the darkness. She didn't know how long he would live, but she knew he wouldn't die alone, not in the cold of abandonment. Sandra turned to Gregory, her gaze as resolute as it had ever been. "Thank you, Greg, but I can't give up on him," she said, her voice firm. Duke didn't give up, and I won't give up on him either. Gregory looked at her, his eyes showing concern, but then he sighed and nodded. "Good luck, Sandra. But I still think maybe you'll regret this." He didn't say anything else, but in his eyes, Sandra saw something more than judgment. There was empathy. He knew she wasn't just saving a dog. She was saving herself. And in that moment, Sandra knew she had made the right decision. Duke needed her, and she needed Duke. Two lost souls, but now, together, they could find their way back. Sandra sat next to Duke, in the quiet space where only the crackling of the fireplace could be heard. The room was warm and peaceful, a stark contrast to the cold and loneliness Duke had once experienced. She placed him near the fire, feeling the warmth gradually spreading from the blanket to the weary parts of his body. Though he didn't move, the closeness to the fire and Sandra's care seemed to have sparked something in him. She fed Duke spoonfuls of warm soup, but he still didn't react. He didn't raise his head, didn't glance up, just lay there silently, his eyes cloudy as if a part of his soul had left his body long ago. Every survival instinct that Sandra had hoped for was no longer there. He no longer had any desire, chased after the sound of the siren, or responded to the attention of others. He just lay there, still, as if in a deep sleep that would never wake up. Sandra sat quietly beside him, feeling not only Duke's despair but also her own. She had brought Duke home, hoping he would find some spark of life, but she wasn't sure what would happen next. She looked at Duke with patience, hoping that after each gentle touch, after each meal, one day he would awaken. Never before had Sandra felt such exhaustion. Anxiety rose in her when she saw that Duke no longer seemed to care about anything, even the warmth of this home. She thought about Gregory's words, that Duke had disconnected from people, that he could never come back. But how could she let him die in that forgotten state? How could she give up on a dog who had spent his entire life sacrificing for others, just because of age and weariness? Sandra knew she couldn't force Duke to eat right away. Each day, each meal, each gentle petting was a way for her to awaken the old memories in him. She knew it would take a long time, but in her heart, Duke wasn't just an abandoned dog. He was a warrior, a soul in need of healing. She gently stroked Duke's thinning coat, feeling the dryness of each strand of fur that no longer gleamed as it once had. Duke was no longer the strong, loyal dog of a family, but now he was just a faded memory in the hearts of those who had forgotten him. But Sandra hadn't forgotten, and she wouldn't let him suffer anymore. A moment later, as she bent down to check the bowl of soup again, Duke stirred slightly. She paused, her heart racing. Duke didn't react much, but he slightly lifted his head, as if sensing her care. A faint light flickered in his eyes. It wasn't a gaze of affection or joy, but one full of resilience, as though a part of him was starting to return, starting to realize that perhaps he wouldn't have to live alone like this forever. Sandra looked into Duke's eyes, and her heart lifted with relief. Even though he didn't eat, even though he still didn't react fully. That small movement, the slight lifting of his head, was a sign, a spark of hope kindling in the darkness. He wasn't a soul that had left its body. He was still there, still in this body, and even though it might only be the beginning, Sandra believed that he would gradually regain his strength. She stood up and walked to the kitchen, grabbed some more soup, and returned to Duke. Though he still didn't respond immediately, Sandra decided to be patient. She wouldn't give up on him. She wouldn't let a warrior fall into oblivion. He was still alive, and with just a small flame, a light in the dark, she believed Duke would find his way back. She sat back down next to Duke, her hand gently stroking his head, comforting him as if to soothe him. Duke still didn't eat, but when she caressed him, she could feel the softness from his old coat, as if a part of him had regained a bit of life. A silent tear rolled down Sandra's cheek, not from pain, but because she felt she was drawing closer to something miraculous. Duke would live again, and though it would take much effort, he wouldn't be the worthless dog anymore. As the flames in the fireplace flickered in the room, Sandra felt the strength that she and Duke could give to each other. She wasn't just caring for a dog. She was helping a soul find its light again. And in that moment, she knew that, though the road ahead would be long, something had changed. A small flame had been lit, and the warm bed would be the first place Duke would feel peace. In the middle of the night, when the room was quiet and darkness had covered the house, Sandra sat silently by the fireplace, watching the flames flicker. In moments like this, she felt a deep loneliness, but also a strange kind of peace. Duke lay beside her, near the fire, his cloudy eyes no longer showing the alertness they once did. He still lay, as if no longer concerned with the world around him. Sandra didn't know why she still couldn't sleep. There was a vague feeling in her, a strong urge that kept her from taking her eyes off Duke. Even though he still lay there, his gaze distant, Sandra could feel a connection between her and Duke, a bond unspoken but profound. The firelight cast shadows that danced on the walls. Sandra gently pushed a few stray hairs from her face and unexpectedly looked up at the photograph on the wall opposite, where there was a picture of Jake, her late husband. Jake and Duke, a photo from their happy days, when Jake was still healthy when the three of them walked together under the sun. Duke, in those days, wasn't the old, frail dog, but a vibrant protector, his bright eyes ready to fight and serve. Sandra stared at the photograph, feeling the silence in the room. Memories of Jake flooded her, of the days when he, and Duke had created loving memories together. She remembered the mornings when she and Jake walked Duke, the times they laughed when Duke clumsily ran around and barked at the shadow. But now, all of that was just the past, a part of a story that had ended long ago. Just then, as Sandra was lost in the photo, Duke suddenly stood up. The movement wasn't frantic but gentle, yet full of awareness. He didn't bark or run to her. It was a slow rise as if called by something deep within him. Duke stood straight, his eyes fixed on Jake's photograph. His ears drooped, his body slightly trembled, but his gaze never left the picture. Sandra watched him, afraid to even breathe, just standing still, her heart pounding in her chest. He was looking at the photo of Jake, the loyal companion he had fought beside for so many years. Duke's eyes seemed to light up strangely, not with dullness but with awareness. He was remembering something, a deep memory that Sandra couldn't fully understand. She couldn't explain why Duke acted this way, but she knew there was something Duke was sensing. He recognized the name in the picture. He remembered the companion he had once protected, the owner he had once loved. Then, as if to confirm something in his mind, Duke let out a soft moan. The sound wasn't one of pain, but a sigh, gentle and sorrowful, as if he were releasing the grief he had carried for so many long years. It was the first time Sandra had heard a sound from Duke since she brought him home, and that small sound was filled with meaning. It wasn't a lament, but a recognition of something lost, a memory long buried. Sandra approached him, her hands trembling slightly as she touched Duke's back. He didn't take his eyes off the picture, but that soft moan seemed to be a call, a reconnection with a forgotten memory. "Jake," Sandra whispered, not knowing if he could hear her. "He's Jake, Duke. He's your friend, the one you fought beside and protected." Sandra couldn't hold back her emotions. At that moment, she understood that Duke hadn't forgotten. He hadn't forgotten the owner who loved and cared for him, the one he had sacrificed for in those missions. Duke remembered those days, and the sadness in his moan was how he expressed his loss. Duke slowly turned his head, his eyes still glowing strangely, and Sandra realized something she hadn't noticed before. He was looking at her, but that gaze wasn't that of a lonely, lost creature. It was filled with recognition, as though he was seeing an old friend, someone he had been waiting for to help him. Sandra sat beside Duke, gently stroking his head. "He didn't leave you, Duke," she whispered, her voice warm, like trying to soothe him. "You won't be alone anymore. We'll be together, just like before." Duke didn't react strongly, but in his eyes, Sandra saw something. It wasn't surprise or confusion, but empathy and understanding. He knew that even though the past had gone, no one of them would be left behind. Sandra felt a new hope rise within her. Maybe he couldn't speak. Maybe he couldn't express everything. But he still understood. And Sandra knew that their journey, though difficult, would start from here. She and Duke would heal together, not only for him, but for her heart as well. A heart that had long lived in the shadows of loss. After that night, Sandra couldn't stop thinking about Duke, about his strange actions and reactions that she couldn't explain. The look in Duke's eyes when he gazed at the photo, the soft moan full of meaning. It all seemed more than just random gestures of an old, tired dog. There was something in his behavior that made Sandra begin to doubt Duke's past. A past that was not just that of a family dog. He wasn't merely an abandoned creature. He could very well have been something that had undergone special training and had been on a mission that Sandra couldn't yet understand. Even though Duke had lived with his old family for 19 years, his reactions to the sound of an ambulance siren or the brightness in his eyes when he looked at Jake's photo weren't like those of an ordinary dog. Duke was not just a family pet. What had he done? Where had he been before he was brought to the old family? Sandra couldn't shake these doubts. She looked at Duke as he lay quietly on the bed, his cloudy eyes still shining with an unusual sharpness, as though he could see through everything around him. A resilience, a caution seemed deeply ingrained in his instincts. Not every dog could react so precisely to sirens, to strange sounds. A soldier, a K9, had to be trained to always be ready and always alert to any danger. And Duke, despite his age and frailty, was still showing undeniable signs of that past. The unsettling feeling weighed heavily on Sandra. She stood up and walked through the house, her mind still revolving around thoughts of Duke, about his past. She had heard Jake speak of the days when they trained K9 dogs, about how they had to be persistent and loyal beyond measure. But those were distant memories. Jake was no longer here to continue telling that story. She had no one to ask, no one to explain the doubts in her heart. When she returned to the living room, Duke's eyes were still fixed on the window, looking outside as if keeping watch for something far away. This only made Sandra's doubts grow stronger. She knew Duke had once been a trained dog, perhaps a warrior, perhaps a protector, but what had he gone through in that past? Sandra sat down beside Duke, her eyes fixed on him. Was his silence the expression of a soldier who had been wounded, of a friend who had endured too many losses, and was now just a shadow of himself? She didn't know, but Sandra felt that she needed to learn more about Duke's past. She needed to find out why he reacted this way, why he showed these signs. Signs of a dog that was not just a pet, but a true warrior. "Duke," Sandra whispered, gently stroking his back. "You're not just an ordinary dog, are you?" This question wasn't for him to answer, but for her to answer for herself. Duke was not just an old, frail dog, but one that carried a much bigger story, a higher mission that he had dedicated his life to fulfilling. Sandra stood up and went to the cupboard, pulling out an old notebook, the one she had found among Jake's belongings. Maybe it held clues about Duke, memories Jake had written down. She opened the notebook, flipping through the pages, reading the old notes about the training and the struggles Jake and Duke had gone through together. A few pages mentioned the missions they had carried out, memories Sandra had never heard about. One entry made Sandra stop. Jake had written about a special incident, a mission he and Duke had undertaken together. It was a mission where Duke had helped resolve a dangerous situation, saving many lives. Duke had fought not just as a police dog, but as a true comrade, a warrior. He hadn't simply done his duty. He had become part of a larger operation, Jake's loyal companion. Sandra sat back, staring at the notebook, feeling as though a door had just opened in her mind. Duke hadn't been just a family dog. He had been an irreplaceable companion in special missions, a warrior who had lived with responsibility and undying loyalty. Duke's actions weren't random. They were signs of a past that wasn't easy to forget. He wasn't an abandoned dog. He was a soul that had lived through war, through challenges. She sighed, knowing that Duke's journey was far from over. But now she understood one thing for sure. Duke didn't just need her care. He needed to be understood, to be respected, and most importantly, he needed to be freed from the painful memories he had carried. Sandra couldn't wait any longer. As the pages of Jake's journal unfolded before her, she not only found memories of Duke, but also realized a truth she hadn't considered. Duke was not just a normal family dog. He was a warrior, a canine who had once carried out dangerous missions, with rigorous training and a heavy sense of responsibility. But Duke's story still hadn't been fully told. She needed to learn more about his past, the days when he and Jake fought together, the training Duke had undergone. And Sandra knew that to uncover the truth, she would need help from those who truly understood the world of canine warriors. She remembered Marcus Evans, a former police officer and canine trainer who had worked with Jake. Marcus was the only one who could help her understand what had happened to Duke, and if he had truly been trained for a greater purpose, Marcus would be the one to know best. Sandra grabbed her phone and quickly called Marcus. She heard the ringing and felt both anxious and nervous. Would Marcus be willing to help her? Would he remember Duke? Remember the years when he and Jake had fought side by side? Very soon, Marcus picked up the phone. His voice was warm, but had a certain depth, as though time had not dulled the seriousness and authority in his words. "Sandra, it's been a while. What's going on?" Sandra felt a little worried, but she tried to keep her voice calm. "Marcus, I need your help," she began. "I have a dog, Duke, and I think he's not just a family dog. He might have been a special canine. He lived with Jake, and I feel like there's something about his past that hasn't been fully told. Could you come visit Duke?" There was a brief silence before Marcus spoke. "Duke? I remember him very well. He was a true warrior. I'll come right away." His voice was gentle but firm. "I'll help you understand Duke better, Sandra. He deserves to know about his past." Sandra felt a wave of new hope flood her heart. Marcus, with all his experience and understanding of the canine world, would be the one to help her uncover the hidden secrets of Duke's past. But she also felt a slight worry. She didn't know if Duke would be ready to face what Marcus would reveal. Would he be willing to confront his past? A past he had tried to forget? A knock on the door rang out the next morning. Sandra stood up, her heart racing as she walked to open the door. Marcus stood there, his familiar soldier's stance. He hadn't changed much since she last saw him, just a few silver strands at his temples, but his eyes still shone with seriousness and a deep understanding of the canine warrior world. He stood there, as though ready to face old memories. "Marcus, thank you for coming," Sandra said, her voice full of gratitude. He nodded, his eyes scanning the room, finally resting on Duke, lying quietly near the fireplace. Duke was still lying, but his eyes weren't as cloudy as before. Even though he didn't react, that gaze, those eyes, were strangely bright. He remembered Marcus. He remembered the training days, the guarding, the important missions he had undertaken with the soldiers. Marcus walked slowly towards Duke, not in haste, but with respect. He sat next to him, gently stroking Duke's back, as though wanting to soothe him, to calm a warrior who had endured too many wounds. "Duke," he said softly. "Hello, old friend." Sandra stood there, watching Marcus and Duke, feeling something very special in the air. The old dog no longer reacted strongly, but Marcus's caresses seemed to soothe him. He was no longer an abandoned dog. He was a veteran warrior, a loyal companion. "He's not just a family dog, is he?" Sandra asked, her voice a little urgent. "What kind of missions did he do?" Marcus took a deep breath, his eyes thoughtful, as though searching for a way to open up the buried memories. Duke was a true warrior, Sandra. He was a K9 in the police force. He carried out important missions that not just any dog could do. He didn't just protect. He was a true comrade in dangerous situations. We went through many challenges together. Sandra stood silent, her eyes wide. She had never known that Duke had such a glorious past. A warrior, a companion in dangerous campaigns. All she knew now was just a small part of a much longer story, a story Duke deserved to know, and Sandra needed to understand better. Sandra sat down next to Marcus, her eyes never leaving Duke. He lay still, his eyes no longer dimmed as before, but they weren't the lively eyes of a warrior who had once given everything for his mission. She felt a strange and choked sensation rising in her chest. She didn't know what to do next, only that she needed to understand more about Duke's past, about the old companion he once was. Marcus continued to sit there, gently stroking Duke's head, as if he were touching a long-forgotten memory that he knew well, but didn't want to leave too many traces of. There was a quiet reverence, an understanding from someone who had once stood beside Duke, someone who knew the things Sandra couldn't yet grasp. Then Marcus spoke, his voice deep, full of seriousness and tinged with sadness. "Duke, he's not just Duke, Sandra," he began, his eyes fixed on Duke as if he wanted to see every tiny detail of the memories he had shared with him. "Duke used to be Shadow." Sandra's head snapped up, not believing what she had just heard. "Shadow?" She repeated the name, feeling like a crucial piece of the puzzle had just been revealed. Marcus nodded, his eyes brightening slightly, but still tinged with gloom. "Yes, Shadow, a legendary K9 in the kidnapping response team. He wasn't just an ordinary dog. He took part in many critical operations, especially kidnappings, and saved many lives in extremely dangerous situations." Marcus's voice echoed like a mournful song, full of respect. Shadow wasn't just a dog, he was a true teammate. Sandra sat frozen, unable to believe what Marcus was saying. Duke, or rather Shadow, was a true warrior, not just in Sandra's eyes, but in the entire world of K9 warriors. She didn't know what to say. What she saw before her, the old, frail dog who had been abandoned, was the protector, the one who had saved lives in the most dangerous situations. He was not just an animal, but a true hero. "How many people did he save?" Sandra asked, her voice thick with emotion. She couldn't fully understand him, but now she felt a profound respect for Duke, a warrior who had once fought with everything he had, only to be forgotten. Marcus paused for a moment, as if reflecting on the memories. He saved at least 3 lives in one major kidnapping case. Without Shadow, we wouldn't have succeeded. He had an incredible instinct, able to find kidnapped victims even when everything seemed impossible. He was one of the best K9s I've ever trained. Marcus's voice softened, a hint of sadness appearing in his eyes. After that mission, Shadow became a legend in the unit. He never gave up, never stopped fighting. Sandra listened in stunned silence. Duke had once been Shadow, a legendary warrior, someone who had sacrificed for the mission, saving many lives, and now he was nothing more than an old, forgotten dog. He had been a protector, a hero in the eyes of his comrades, but now, in Sandra's eyes, he was just an old friend trying to find his light again in the dark. So why did the old family abandon him? Sandra asked, her heart full of frustration. She couldn't understand why those who had loved Duke, who had lived with him for 19 years, would abandon a warrior like him. Marcus looked at her, sadness in his eyes. The cost of a K9 is not small, Sandra. They only saw an old dog, a creature who no longer had the strength to fight. The missions were over, and so they let him go. No one saw the true value of Shadow, of Duke, the one who had spent his whole life protecting them. Sandra felt a pain flood her heart. Duke was not just a dog. He was a warrior who had lived his life for a mission. But when he was no longer useful, he was discarded and treated like a worthless object. She looked at Duke, her heart swelling with both sorrow and new determination. He deserved a better life. A life filled with the love and respect that he had always earned. He's not just a warrior, Sandra, Marcus continued, his eyes full of respect. He's a friend, a teammate I'll never forget. He looked at Sandra, his voice warm. And I believe he won't forget you, Sandra. He can still live, still fight in his way. Sandra bent down, placing her hand on Duke's head, feeling the resilience in his gaze. Duke had not given up, and now she would never abandon him. She promised to help Duke find himself again, to help him remember what he had lost, and most importantly, to give him the life he deserved. After Marcus left, Sandra couldn't forget what he had just revealed about Duke, about his past, the name Shadow, and the glorious feats that Duke had accomplished. She couldn't stop thinking about that past, about everything Duke had been through, the dangerous missions he had fought for, the sacrifices that had never been properly rewarded. She wondered why everything had ended this way. Why would a warrior like Duke be abandoned, forgotten so callously? Duke still lay quietly on the bed, his eyes no longer cold like before, but still not completely warm. He didn't react strongly when Sandra came close, only lying there, occasionally letting out a sigh, as if there were painful memories that still couldn't be erased. Even though he had been brought to a new, loving home, his past seemed to haunt him day by day, night after night. Marcus had revealed to Sandra that Duke was not just an ordinary dog. He had been part of a special mission, a mission that had left deep wounds in his heart, wounds that no one could see. Duke was not just a dog. He was a warrior, a teammate in life and death situations. But in a failed mission, Duke had lost a close companion, a teammate he had fought and protected beside. And from then on, he was forced into retirement, no longer allowed to go out on missions. But the truth behind those scars still hadn't been exposed. Sandra felt a deep pain rise in her heart as she remembered Marcus's words. Duke wasn't just an old, frail dog. He was a warrior who had endured tremendous loss. He had lost a close friend in a failed mission, and that wound would never fully heal. Losing a teammate, losing a part of himself, Duke could never forget those memories. However, Sandra realized an even more painful truth. Duke's old family hadn't properly reported the real reason for his retirement. Instead of talking about the loss and the trauma Duke had endured, they simply said that Duke was too old and no longer useful. They didn't mention the battles he had fought, the wounds he had borne, both physical and emotional. He was just an old dog who no longer had any value, abandoned and forgotten, with no one standing up to protect him. Sandra felt the injustice in her heart. She couldn't accept that Duke, a strong warrior, a great companion, was treated this way. She remembered the times Duke had stood tall, his eyes looking out the window as if guarding something. She realized that even though he had grown weak, he still carried a part of his past, a part of the triumphs that only he truly understood. As Sandra stroked Duke's head, she felt something profound, a sense of familiarity and empathy. She knew that, whether he wanted it or not, the past would never leave him. The name Shadow was not just a name. It was a part of his soul, a part of the great feats he had contributed to the K9 team and to the people he had protected. She couldn't let those memories fade into obscurity. "Duke," Sandra whispered, "you're not a useless dog. You're a warrior, and I won't let you suffer alone." Duke didn't react, but Sandra could feel the quiet within him, a silence not from giving up, but from a silent agreement. The feeling within Sandra grew stronger. Duke needed to be seen again, not as an old, weak dog, but as a warrior who had lost his teammate, a protector who had given everything in a mission that had never truly ended. She couldn't let him continue to live in obscurity. Sandra was determined to do everything she could to help Duke, to help him live again with the honor and dignity of a canine warrior. She would uncover the truth, help Duke face his past, and give him the life that he deserved. He was not a discarded dog. He was a hero, a warrior, and he deserved a different ending. One early morning, as the weak sunlight filtered through the curtains, Sandra received an unexpected call from the neighboring family. She already knew about Lily, the 6-year-old girl living next door. Lily was a smart little girl, but there was one thing that worried everyone. She had a communication disorder. Lily couldn't communicate in the usual way that other children her age could, and this often made her feel lonely. When Sandra heard that Lily wanted to visit, she didn't hesitate to invite her over. The little girl was always sweet, but Sandra knew that Lily was still trying to find a way to connect with the world around her. Lily came over mid-morning, holding a small doll she loved. With her bright eyes and shy expression, Lily stepped into Sandra's house, her gaze never leaving Duke, who was lying near the fireplace. The old dog was still there, but today, Sandra noticed something strange in the air. Duke wasn't his usual self, lying quietly as a part of the cold room. He shifted a little, his ears drooping, his cloudy eyes lighting up when Lily walked in. Strangely, Duke seemed to sense Lily's presence right away. He stood up, not with the weariness or sluggishness he usually had, but with an unusual vitality. He sniffed around the girl, then approached her, his long nose trembling, as if searching for something special in her. Duke's movements were gentle, as though he were checking who this new person was, someone he felt a connection to. Lily stood still, a little surprised, but her eyes sparkled with curiosity, as if she understood that Duke wasn't like the other dogs she had met. Then, unexpectedly, Duke let out a soft sound, a quiet whine, not of pain, but of comfort. It was the first time Sandra had heard that sound since bringing Duke home. It wasn't the whimper of an old, weak dog, but an expression of connection, a way for Duke to show sympathy and understanding toward Lily. Sandra stood watching, her heart lit with a new warmth. Duke was no longer a sad dog, no longer just a dog seeking a place to rest. He was connecting, sensing something in Lily that she couldn't understand. "Lily?" Sandra said softly, smiling as she saw the magic unfolding. "It seems Duke likes you. He's never reacted like this before." Lily stood still, her eyes bright. She bent down, gently petting Duke's head. Though she said nothing, it seemed as if she knew how to reach out to him, a way to connect without words. Duke didn't pull away, nor did he bark. He simply sniffed around her, as though sensing and understanding that Lily was not a stranger. The sight left Sandra astonished. Duke seemed to sense the harmony, the special connection with Lily, even though this little girl couldn't talk or communicate like other children. Was Lily the one Duke had been searching for to share an unspoken pain? Sandra didn't know, but the feeling in her was stronger than ever. Duke not only needed her, but he also needed someone who could understand the hurt he had carried through all the years spent in the shadows. "Duke," Sandra whispered, seeing the compassion in his eyes. "You've found your friend, haven't you?" Lily said nothing, but her eyes sparkled, and Sandra knew that a strange and beautiful bond was forming between an old dog and a young girl. Duke wasn't just living for existence. He was seeking understanding and love, and in Lily he found a companion, a soul just like his own. Sandra sat down next to Lily and Duke, feeling the peace in the room. She realized that sometimes friendship and connection don't need to be expressed in words. It is understanding, the touching of lives through the smallest and most delicate gestures. Duke and Lily had found something in each other without needing to explain it. In the days following the strange meeting between Duke and Lily, Sandra noticed a subtle yet hopeful change in Duke's behavior. Although the signs were still faint, she could sense the shift in him. Duke began eating again, no longer rejecting the meals Sandra prepared for him. At first it was only small, reluctant bites, as if he was still hesitant to accept the food. But Sandra noticed he was gradually regaining his appetite, something she had worried about for so long. Though it wasn't a quick or drastic change, every time Duke finished eating, he would lie down gently by the fireplace, as if seeking some comfort, some warmth to soothe his old pain. He no longer withdrew into the dark corners and lay motionless like a sad shadow. He began lying near the fire, where the warmth spread, and occasionally Duke would stretch out, as if wanting to move, wanting to live, wanting to continue. Sandra couldn't hide the joy in her heart. Duke, the dog she had brought home from those cold, lonely days, was now beginning to find his vitality again. She knew this wasn't a miracle, but a clear sign of hope. Duke wasn't just existing. He wanted to live. One morning when Sandra woke up, she saw Duke standing firmly on all fours, walking a few slow steps around the room. Although his steps were still a bit shaky, there was no denying that Duke had truly started to move again, no longer lying silently in the indifference of sadness. She stood still, watching every step Duke took, her heart pounding with emotion. He was fighting, though unspoken. His actions spoke louder than words. Duke stopped near the fireplace, gazing at the flames, as if seeking something, some comfort Sandra couldn't put into words. His eyes were no longer cloudy like before, and Sandra felt in them a resilience, something she hadn't seen in Duke before. He was still remembering, still seeking a connection to the past. But now, he was beginning to embrace a new life, beginning to look forward. Sandra walked over and sat down beside Duke, and she felt a noticeable change. He no longer shied away from her attention and recoiled from her touches. Instead, he lay quietly beside her, his eyes looking up at Sandra with a relaxed expression she had never seen before. Duke no longer silently awaited death as he had before. He was gradually finding his faith in life again. "You're coming back to life, Duke," Sandra whispered, gently stroking his rough coat. "You still have so much to do, and I'll be here with you." Duke didn't respond, but he didn't need to. The peacefulness in the room seemed to resonate with the rhythm of their breathing. Duke was regaining his strength, not through words or encouragement, but through each step, each breath he courageously took. He was coming back to life, little by little, and Sandra knew that though there was a long journey ahead, this was the beginning of a new one. Sandra felt hope blossoming in her heart. He was no longer just an abandoned dog. He was a warrior, a friend who had once fought with all his might and was now finding himself again. Hope may fade, but there will always be new opportunities to reignite the fire in the heart. And for Duke, that fire, though still faint, was slowly beginning to blaze again. Sandra had just gotten up to fetch more food for Duke, when suddenly a violent seizure struck. The old dog couldn't react in time. His body began to tremble uncontrollably, and agonized sounds came from his throat. Sandra spun around in panic, seeing Duke writhing in the seizure, his steps no longer steady, his cloudy eyes glazed, staring into the void as though he couldn't comprehend anything around him. Even though he had regained some of his strength, his life was once again under threat, in a way Sandra never could have anticipated. Sandra rushed to Duke's side, trying to hold him still, but the seizures grew stronger, his body jerking with each wave, seemingly beyond his control. Calm was no longer an option for her at that moment. She quickly scooped Duke into her arms, his body still shaking, praying she could get him to the emergency clinic fast enough. Her heart was racing, her chest felt like it might burst. Not for a second could Sandra stop worrying. The panic forced her to drive recklessly, gripping the steering wheel tightly not daring to glance in the rearview mirror for fear that the dog in her arms wouldn't survive the journey. He had been through so much hardship in his life, fought, lived, and protected. Now, could he survive this latest test? When Sandra arrived at the emergency clinic, she could barely stand. She got out of the car and carried Duke inside, not saying a word, just looking at the doctor with a pleading gaze. Dr. Hannah Whitaker immediately took Duke, and the team of doctors rushed to provide every measure of emergency care. "Sandra, stay calm, doctor," Whitaker said as she took Duke into the emergency room, her voice not betraying any fear, but Sandra could hear the tension in it. She stood outside the door of the emergency room, her heart thumping loudly, unable to stop thinking about Duke's condition. As a doctor who had witnessed countless illnesses and emergencies, Dr. Whitaker couldn't hide the worry on her face as she checked Duke's condition. A moment later, Dr. Whitaker came out, her face serious. "Sandra, he's in very bad shape," she said. "His body is deteriorating rapidly. His major organs, like the kidneys and liver, are showing signs of severe failure. I'm sorry to tell you, but without timely intervention, his condition could become very dangerous." Sandra felt like her heart had dropped into a deep abyss. Those words hit her like a slap to the face, and she could hardly believe what she was hearing. Duke, the warrior she had saved, was not only fighting against age, but also enduring deep, hidden injuries in his body. He wasn't just any dog. He was a warrior, a protector who had given everything to great missions, and now he was suffering consequences no one could see. "Can he survive?" Sandra asked, her voice trembling, unable to keep calm any longer. She just wanted to know if there was anything she could do to save Duke, to prevent him from ending his life in pain and loneliness. Dr. Whitaker looked at her, her eyes full of sympathy but also filled with harsh reality. "We'll do our best," she said, "but Duke's age and current health condition are very serious. If you can, I'd advise you to prepare yourself for any possibility. He's lived a life of glory, Sandra, but he's no longer the strong dog he once was." Sandra couldn't say anything. She just stood still, her eyes filled with tears as she looked at the emergency room door where Duke was being treated. She couldn't accept this. He was a warrior. He had fought through countless battles, and now he had to face the destruction of his body. Sandra sat down again, sighing deeply. A feeling of helplessness flooded her, but also a sense of determination. She couldn't let Duke go without fighting for him. She couldn't let him suffer an undeserving end. He was her companion, a fierce warrior she would never abandon. During the time Duke was in the emergency room, Sandra couldn't take her eyes off him, praying for him to live, wishing that he could feel that he was still loved, still worthy of living a life that reflected all he had given. Sandra sat silently in the waiting room, staring at her hands, unable to stop tightly clutching her handkerchief. She could feel her heart racing in her chest, each breath shallow like waves crashing on the shore. The hours dragged on, the tormenting thoughts continually weighing down on her mind, and one question kept swirling in her head. Could she let Duke go? Or should she fight alongside him one more time? She couldn't count how many times she asked herself if Duke could endure any longer, if he could continue living when his body was so worn out, though no one could deny the courage in each of his actions. Duke had survived the harshest trials, but now, with his body completely drained, would his resilience be enough to overcome it all? Was she the one who would stand between life and death, deciding for a warrior who had never stopped fighting his whole life? She remembered Duke when he was still Shadow, the legendary dog in the K9 unit, always ready to face danger, never giving up, always fighting with everything for the mission. Despite living through hard times, still loyal and protective, Duke deserved a beautiful end, an end that wasn't death in silence. Sandra looked down at her hands, feeling the cold sweat forming. Her chest tightened. Suddenly she heard Duke's faint breathing from the emergency room. The seizures had stopped, but his breaths were still labored, like a warrior who couldn't escape the deep wounds within him. And just as she was bracing herself to hear more from Dr. Whitaker, She knew she had to make a decision right now, no matter how difficult. Dr. Whitaker walked in, and Sandra saw her face, no longer the detached expression of a doctor, but one full of deep empathy. The two of them stood beside Duke's bed, their gazes meeting in silence. Dr. Whitaker spoke first, her voice gentle but heavy. "Sandra, I want you to think carefully. He's in very bad shape. Duke's major organs are failing rapidly. He may not survive unless we intervene immediately, but—" She paused for a moment, her eyes gliding over Duke, lying on the bed. "If you want, we can do everything. But I have to be clear with you. His body no longer has the strength to keep fighting for much longer." Sandra felt her heart twist. The thought of saying goodbye to Duke was suffocating. He wasn't just any dog. He was a warrior, her companion. She knew that a part of his heart still wanted to fight, still wanted to live, even though his body was too weak to continue. But was it selfish of her to keep him here, when he might have to suffer even more? A pain that could not be expressed in words welled up inside Sandra, but she knew that her love for Duke couldn't end there. She had promised she wouldn't let him be alone, promised she would be with him through the most painful days, and now she had to keep that promise. She couldn't let him go when there was still a glimmer of hope. "We'll fight," Sandra said, her voice steady, no longer wavering. She looked Dr. Whitaker straight in the eyes, her hands clenched. "We can't let him give up. We'll fight with him." Dr. Whitaker looked at Sandra, a rare spark of light in her eyes. "We'll do everything we can. I know your decision is not easy, but we won't let Duke suffer alone." Her voice was soft but sure. "We'll help him." Sandra felt a warm sensation flooding her heart, soothing her anxiety and pain. She had made her decision, and no matter how difficult the path ahead was, she wouldn't give up. Sandra turned to look at Duke, feeling his strength in every breath he took, as if Duke could hear her words and was ready to fight alongside her. He was still a warrior. He had never given up, and now she wouldn't let him face this battle alone. After deciding to fight, Sandra couldn't turn back. Each day, each minute, each hour became an unceasing challenge for her. The harsh days began, and she, alongside Marcus, threw all their energy into taking care of Duke, making sure he didn't fall into any pain or despair that they couldn't prevent. Together, they watched every step Duke took, administering medicine, massaging his tired body, and helping him with physical therapy to regain any remaining strength. Every small task became a challenge they couldn't afford to overlook. Marcus, a longtime K9 trainer, always shared his experience and patience with Sandra. They worked together as teammates, not only in caring for Duke, but also in facing the moments filled with hope and the fear that rose each day. Every time Duke tried to walk, even though his steps were weak and slow, Sandra could feel the joy and determination in each of his movements. Duke had never given up, and Sandra would never let him give up again. Every evening, she sat beside Duke, feeding him spoonfuls of soft food, carefully to avoid tiring him out. Duke ate very little, but those were moments Sandra would never forget. Each time he swallowed, she saw a part of his life force return, as if a part of Duke was no longer the shadow of the past, but a dog fighting against fate. Even if his life was only small sparks, Sandra knew that hope was slowly being revived. One night, after a long day of worry and tension, as she gently massaged Duke's body, he suddenly raised his head. Duke looked at her, his eyes no longer dull as before, but gleaming a little, reflecting the dim light from the lamp in the room. And then, at that moment, Duke licked her hand for the first time since she brought him home. Sandra felt a warm sensation surge in her heart, as if he was sending her a silent message. That lick, though small, was full of emotion. It was like a thank you from the depths of Duke's heart. A thank you without words, simply an act of love from a dog who had no strength left. It was the first time he had actively shown affection, and Sandra felt that Duke still had some fire in his heart, a fire that would never go out, no matter how much pain or sorrow he had endured. Marcus stood at the door, watching the scene. "He's starting to find himself again," he said, his voice full of emotion. "Sandra, you've done something no one dared think possible. He's starting to trust people again." Sandra didn't answer. She only looked at Duke, her heart full of empathy and love. Duke was a warrior, and no matter how weak he became, in Sandra's eyes, he was still a warrior who would never give up. She sat down, stroked his head again, and felt that even though these days were hard and painful, they were also the most precious time for both of them. The days that followed passed with Sandra and Marcus's relentless efforts. Duke was still very weak, but there was one thing Sandra could feel. He no longer gave up. He started showing small signs of recovery, like attempting to walk, eating, and even gently shaking his head when he felt Sandra and Marcus's loving care. Though he couldn't run around as before, Duke had regained a part of his strength, something Sandra knew would help him continue fighting, even though the road ahead was still filled with challenges. Duke was no longer the dog she had brought home from the shelter. He was a true warrior, and now she would never let him give up. Day by day, Sandra could feel the small but important signs in Duke's recovery process. He no longer curled up in dark corners, but began to react more strongly to familiar sounds, to words Sandra slowly realized could awaken memories in him. Though his body was still weak, his legs still trembling, his eyes gleamed with resilience, as if a part of Duke had survived all the pain. One afternoon, when Marcus visited Sandra, he brought with him an old training kit, the tools he had used in his years training canines. He looked at Duke, thought for a moment, and then said to Sandra, "I think it's time to try something. Old trigger words might be the key to bringing him back to his instincts. If Duke was ever a warrior, those memories might help him find strength within again." Sandra looked at Marcus, her eyes full of worry and hope. She knew that awakening those old memories might help Duke, but it might also force him to face the pain of the past. However, she knew that no matter how painful it was, Duke needed to find himself again, to realize that he was still a warrior, not just an old, weak dog waiting for death. Marcus approached Duke, his voice deep and resolute as he said a familiar word, "Search." Sandra couldn't believe her eyes when she saw Duke react immediately. He stood up, and though his body was still trembling and weak, he did something she thought would be impossible. He stood up, his eyes shining brightly as if recognizing something deep within his memories. Duke didn't just stand up slowly, but also responded with pure instinct, his eyes flashing with determination, as if he had heard the trigger word, a word he had heard countless times during his years on duty. Sandra held her breath, unable to believe what she had just seen. Duke's whole body trembled, but the look in his eyes, the brilliance in them, was like a small spark piercing through the night. He still remembered. He still remembered the missions, the endless searches, and the victories he had achieved. "He remembers," Marcus said, his voice filled with admiration. "Duke is not just an ordinary dog. He's a real warrior, and the word search has awakened everything he once was." Sandra felt a wave of emotion flood through her. She couldn't hold back the tears, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of faith and hope. He, Duke, was still alive, still had instincts that no one could take away from him. "You're not just an old dog, Duke," Sandra whispered. "You're a warrior." She bent down, stroking his head, feeling his gentle lick on her hand. That lick wasn't just a sign of affection. It was a sign of awakening, of a dog who had never given up, no matter how the world turned. Duke was coming back to life, and not just living through memories, but through a new future, a future Sandra knew he deserved. One afternoon, with the fresh air of the forest behind the house still carrying the warmth of spring, Sandra and Lily strolled along the familiar trail. Lily, as always, seemed quite cheerful, though she still struggled to communicate easily with the world around her. But today, it seemed that Duke, the dog, was giving her a sense of calmness unlike any before. Duke walked alongside them, his eyes brighter than ever, as though he was searching for something that Sandra couldn't fully understand. They had walked quite a distance into the forest, reaching a large old tree stump they had passed many times before, when suddenly Duke rushed toward an ancient tree and began digging frantically. His paws moved violently through the soil. Sandra stopped in her tracks, startled by the sudden change in Duke's behavior. Though she knew Duke had shown some positive signs, this time, he wasn't just acting out of excitement. There was something very unusual happening. Sandra called for Lily to stop, then walked closer to Duke. She bent down and saw that Duke was digging deep, barking in strange, determined, and persistent sounds. Unlike previous times, Duke didn't stop this time. He dug deeper, as if he was searching for something buried deep in the earth. Before Sandra could fully grasp what was happening, she suddenly noticed a trail of dried blood slowly emerging from beneath the dirt. Her limbs went numb. The blood wasn't fresh. It was old and dry, but marked with an undeniable presence. Sandra hurriedly pulled out her phone and called Marcus, her voice frantic and filled with worry. "Marcus, I need you here right now. Duke, he found something in the forest. There's blood. What do we do now?" Within moments, Marcus responded, and before long he arrived, standing beside Sandra and looking at the tree. He silently observed the scene, his sharp eyes noticing signs that Sandra couldn't quite understand. "Duke isn't searching for something by chance, Sandra. He has his reasons. This isn't a coincidence." Sandra felt a rising sense of anxiety. She looked at Duke, who was still digging persistently, as if oblivious to the discovery. It was clear that he hadn't just found this trail of blood by accident. Duke had lived through so many challenges, and so many missions, and perhaps he was sensing something that Sandra couldn't explain. After Marcus examined the area closely, he tilted his head, as if considering something. "This is the trace of an old wound, and I think Duke knows this place. He might have been here before, on a previous mission. We need to dig deeper to understand more." Sandra anxiously looked at Duke, then back at the dried blood beneath the soil. The tension and uncertainty in her heart kept growing, but she also understood that this might be a coincidence that couldn't be ignored. Duke had reacted strongly to this trace, and it proved that he still remembered something deep in his memory. Marcus nodded slightly, as if he understood this was a signal that couldn't be ignored. "We need to continue. If Duke is leading us here, he might know something important." Though Sandra's heart was heavy with worry, she also felt a strange urge. She couldn't just stand there. She had to do something. Together with Marcus, they began digging deeper into the earth, hoping to find a clearer clue about what Duke was trying to search for. He had found something that no one else had noticed, and now Sandra knew that Duke's journey to regain his memory wasn't just about him, but also about the buried secrets that she needed to unravel to truly help him come back to life. The entire forest seemed to quiet down in silence, with only the sounds of dirt and branches under Sandra's hands as she and Marcus continued digging. Duke stood beside them, still persistent in sniffing and watching the tree, where the blood traces had been discovered. He did not step back, his eyes glowing brightly as if guiding them toward something that only he understood. The sense that Duke was not just a dog, but a true warrior, had fully taken over Sandra. After a while of digging deeper, Marcus suddenly stopped, his gaze falling on an object buried in the soil. He gently pulled out a small, old pouch, wrapped in a damp velvet cloth. When he opened the pouch, Sandra saw a small item inside which appeared to be a child's toy, covered in dirt, but its shape was still recognizable. Sandra felt a slight shock as she looked at the object, because it wasn't just any ordinary item. It was a small cloth doll, but something in her gut told her that this object was connected to a story they didn't fully know yet. Marcus looked at the object, his expression becoming pensive, as though memories from long ago were slowly resurfacing. "We need to revisit that case," he said, his voice lowering. "This might be the remainder of the case from years ago, the kidnapping of the little girl that Shadow, Duke's former name, had been hunting but could never solve. Sandra turned, her eyes wide with surprise but filled with a deep connection. The kidnapping case? The one Duke worked on when he was still K9? She remembered what Marcus had told her about Duke before, the missions he had undertaken, and the pain he felt when he was forced into retirement after a failed event that no one had ever resolved. Now, Sandra began to realize that the case had never truly ended, and perhaps Duke was bringing the solution to an unwritten story. Marcus looked at Sandra, his eyes full of concern and doubt. Yes, that kidnapping left him injured, and after that, he couldn't continue the investigation. But that case was never fully closed, Sandra. And now, Duke seems to be leading us to a new clue. Sandra felt a rush of emotion fill her. Duke wasn't just a dog who had survived so many challenges. He was also a dog bound to a mission he had never completed. A mission that, even now, after so many years, he still longed to solve. Marcus continued. When the kidnapping happened, Shadow had found the trace of the little girl. But then, suddenly, all traces vanished. He searched everywhere but couldn't find the victim. We thought the case was closed, but now, with Duke's reaction to this item, I think he's trying to recover what was lost. Sandra stood, frozen, a suffocating feeling overwhelming her. The old dog she had taken in, the one she had brought home, wasn't just a companion but also an unrecognized hero. Duke had never given up, even when everyone thought he was past his prime. "So what do we do next?" Sandra asked, her eyes now burning with determination. "He can't live with the past forever. We need to clear everything up. We have to find the truth." Marcus looked at Sandra, his eyes wavering for a moment. But then he nodded. "We will. I'll help you. We'll find what was lost." Sandra looked at Duke, standing beside her, his eyes still filled with strength, though his legs were weak and his body tired. She knew that this wasn't the time to turn back. It was the time to keep fighting, not just for Duke, but for everything he had represented. Duke deserved an answer to his past, and she would be the one to stand by him as they searched for the truth. Since Marcus and Sandra found the child's toy in the forest, everything had completely changed. Duke, the old dog with a mysterious past, was not only Sandra's loyal companion, but also part of a story that had never been solved. The traces he had discovered in the forest, his unusual reactions to familiar keywords, everything pointed to a deep secret that was being hidden. After contacting the police and providing new information, Marcus and Sandra continued their journey to seek the truth. The kidnapping case that Duke had once been involved in had left its mark on him, and now it was his instinctive responses that were gradually leading them toward a new revelation. The police decided to reopen the case files, a decision Sandra was certain would change everything. One morning, the police and Marcus made plans to investigate an abandoned house about 5 miles from the forest where they had found the bloodstains. The house had been deserted for years. No one had lived there. But what Duke had discovered in the forest made Marcus suspicious. This could be a part of the case no one had paid attention to, and now it might be the key to unlocking all the secrets Sandra and Marcus had never anticipated. When they arrived at the abandoned house, the atmosphere made Sandra shiver. The emptiness and coldness of the place enveloped the space. The wooden doors were rotting, the windows shattered, and overgrown weeds surrounded the house. Despite its outward appearance as an abandoned building, Sandra felt that this house contained a story they needed to uncover. Marcus stepped up to the doorstep, his eyes fixed on a hidden corner of the house. "We need to check this room," he said to Sandra, the seriousness in his voice making her uneasy. Together they entered, moving carefully as if afraid to disturb the stillness that filled the air. As they walked through each room, Sandra felt something strange. Although the house seemed deserted, there was a heavy atmosphere, as if someone was still hiding inside. When they stepped into a small room in the corner of the house, Sandra suddenly heard a faint sound, like a soft breath. Duke, as if hearing that sound from afar, suddenly stopped and headed toward the room. He moved closer, sniffing the air, and began wagging his tail, though his body was still weak. Sandra felt a strong sense of urgency, as if Duke was leading them to something important. When Marcus and Sandra opened the door to the room, they were shocked to find a small girl lying on an old bed, her body frail, her eyes still open but lifeless, as if she had been too tired from the pain and darkness of being locked away for so long. The girl didn't react, only breathing steadily, gently, as though she was in a deep, endless sleep. Sandra's heart clenched. She couldn't imagine what the girl must have suffered during her time in captivity. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she knew now was not the time to cry. This little girl had been saved, thanks to Duke's persistence and instincts. "This girl," Marcus murmured, his voice low and choked. "She is the victim that Shadow, Duke, was searching for all those years ago. She wasn't just part of the case, but he did everything he could to find her. We've missed so much." Sandra turned and looked at Duke. He stood beside her, his eyes still full of determination. Though his legs were weak, Sandra knew that Duke was not just an ordinary dog. He had spent his whole life fighting, and now, despite his age and frailty, he was still a warrior, continuing the journey, guided by the strength of his memory and instincts. Looking at the girl being rescued, Sandra knew that Duke had completed his mission. He had not only saved this girl, but had also opened a new chapter in a case that had been forgotten. Duke hadn't given up, even when everyone around him thought he was past his prime. He still had value, still had strength, and with every step he took, he proved that nothing could extinguish the fighting spirit in the heart of a soldier. Since Duke, or Shadow, rescued the little girl, his story quickly became a phenomenon in the community. News of the heroic actions of a 19-year-old K9 dog, once serving in the anti-kidnapping unit, became an inspiration to many. His appearance in the media made the whole state admire him. The image of Duke, a brave warrior, despite his age, still unwilling to give up on his mission, touched the hearts of millions. Sandra couldn't help but feel proud of Duke, though she never thought a day would come when he would be honored like this. Duke was not only her loyal companion, but also a hero in the eyes of the community, a soldier who had spent his life fighting and protecting. Duke's story spread widely in the media, with articles praising his resilience, loyalty, and bravery. Photos of Duke, his eyes full of resolve, shining with an unquenchable light, moved countless people to tears. The 19-year-old dog, who had almost given up due to old age, had now become a symbol of loyalty, never giving up. One morning, as Sandra sat in her living room, a thick envelope was delivered to her. She opened it, and inside was a handwritten letter from the state governor, written in a formal and warm style. Sandra looked at the letter, reading each word carefully, and realized that this was not just a simple thank you note. "Dear Mrs. Sandra Miller, we would like to extend our heartfelt thanks to you and Duke, Shadow, for the courage and loyalty both of you have shown to the community. Duke's actions, as an experienced K9 with an impressive age, saved an innocent child's life and opened a new chapter in an unsolved kidnapping case. His resilience not only saved a life, but reminded all of us of the value of loyalty and sacrifice. We are deeply honored to inform you that Duke will receive a special award from the state government and will be named the Hero Who Returned for his heroic actions. We look forward to meeting you and Duke at the upcoming official ceremony to honor him. Sincerely, Governor William H. Carter." Sandra felt a wave of strong emotion swell inside her as she finished reading the letter. Duke had been recognized not just as a loyal dog, but as a true hero, one who had completed his mission without needing recognition or praise. He had saved a child, but what moved Sandra most was that he had rediscovered himself in the process. Duke's story wasn't just about a dog. It was about the strength of loyalty, perseverance, and bravery that he had shown throughout his life. Sandra looked over at Duke, lying on the bed beside the fireplace. His eyes were no longer cloudy as before. They now shone with vitality. He was no longer an old, weak dog, no longer just a companion, but a true warrior who had done something no one could have expected. She gently sat next to him, petting his head, and felt a joy fill her heart. She knew that, though he was aging, though he was weakened by the many years that had passed, he was still a hero, and his story would forever live in her heart, and in the hearts of those who knew of his resilience. The official ceremony took place at the state capitol. Sandra and Duke were invited to attend, and when Duke was awarded the Hero Who Returned medal, the applause from everyone rang out like a harmonious song full of emotion. Duke, though much weaker now, still stood firm, his eyes never leaving Sandra. The pride and quiet joy Sandra felt in her heart couldn't be expressed in words. In the days after the ceremony, Sandra no longer saw Duke just as her dog, but as a warrior who had completed a great mission. He had helped save a life, helped solve a case that seemed unsolvable, and most importantly, he had proven that no matter the circumstances, loyalty and love could bring about great change. Duke was not just a loyal companion. He was a hero no one could ever forget. The day of the ceremony arrived, and the atmosphere in the State Hall was filled with dignity and emotion. Sandra could feel each beat of her heart as she and Duke stood among the crowd, preparing for a moment she had never imagined. This was not just an ordinary event of recognition. It was a special ceremony for a silent hero, an unforgettable warrior, K9 Shadow. Duke stood beside Sandra, his body much weaker, but his eyes still shone with strength and determination. He was no longer the old, frail dog people thought he was. He was a true hero, a warrior who had completed his mission despite enduring the trials of time and pain. Sandra looked at Duke, her heart filled with pride and love. She knew that, while no one could change his past, he deserved to be recognized, to be honored for everything he had done. When Duke's name was announced over the microphone, every eye in the hall turned toward him, and then a round of applause erupted like a heartfelt thank you for the resilience of a loyal friend. Sandra stood still, her eyes never leaving Duke, her own eyes glowing with pride and emotion. When the announcer declared that Duke would receive the Medal of Honor, Sandra could feel that not only Duke but everyone around could sense the deep meaning of this moment. This was the first time Duke was called by his true name, K9 Shadow. That name was not just a label, but a symbol of loyalty, sacrifice, and the unconditional love he had given his entire life to justice and protection. Marcus, Duke's former partner, stood at the side of the stage, his eyes welling with tears, unable to hold back his emotions as he watched his teammate being honored. He remembered the years of service Shadow had given, the countless hardships, the missions that no one could have completed without Shadow's courage and determination. For Marcus, Shadow was not just a canine dog, but a friend, a teammate he had fought alongside. Now, seeing him on stage, he could not hold back his tears. "He gave everything for us," Marcus said quietly, as he moved forward to present the medal to Duke. He embraced Duke, tears flowing, not out of weakness, but from the deep affection he had for his partner. Sandra watched them, feeling a rush of emotion. This wasn't just a victory for Duke, but a victory for friendship, teamwork, and loyalty. He had lived and fought, and now he had received the recognition he so rightfully deserved. It was a story of resilience, sacrifice, and the belief that no matter what challenges we face, as long as we don't give up, we can still triumph. When the medal was placed around Duke's neck, the hall erupted once again in thunderous applause, for they weren't just honoring a dog, but a true hero, a warrior who would never give up. Sandra knelt, gently petting Duke's head, feeling a powerful love and pride. She knew that, despite his age, despite all the injuries, he was still the most loyal friend she had ever had. Duke's story didn't end here. It would live on in the hearts of those who had known him. He was not just a dog, but a legend, and with each passing day, he continued to inspire us all with his resilience, loyalty, and boundless love. After everything that had happened, Sandra felt that, finally, she and Duke had found a place that he could truly call home. A place not only where he would be honored, but also where he could rest and live the remaining days of his life surrounded by love and care. That was why she decided to open a training center for retired canine dogs, a place where the warriors no longer called to duty could find peace, a place where love and respect would always be present. The center was named Jake and Shadow Haven, a name that was both a tribute to Jake, Sandra's late husband, and to Duke, Shadow, the hero who had completed his mission. These retired canine dogs, once strong and loyal, would no longer be called to action, but here they would be cared for, loved, and live as part of a family. On the first day of the center, Sandra, along with Lily and Duke, stood in the soft afternoon sunlight, gazing at the large garden full of green grass. Duke lay on the grass, his eyes half closed in a light sleep, as if after all those years of hardship, he was finally finding the peace he so rightfully deserved. Sandra sat beside him, smiling as she looked at Duke, then turned her gaze to Lily, who was sitting beside her, her eyes glowing with innocent light and love. For the first time in many years, Duke no longer waited for death. He no longer had to fight, no longer had to search for salvation. He had lived enough, and now he simply needed to feel the peace, the tranquility that Sandra had brought him. No more the tension of grueling missions, no more facing the pains of age. He was surrounded only by unconditional love and respect from everyone around him. Sandra sat down beside Duke, gently stroking his back, her hands softly gliding over his thick coat. The feeling within her was one of peace, of harmony between the past and the present, between the painful memories and the new joys. She looked at Duke, and his gaze met hers, not just the gaze of a dog, but of a companion, a warrior who had endured so many trials. Lily ran over, sat next to Duke, and began to stroke his fur, and Duke didn't pull his paw back, instead gently licking her hand as if responding to the affection. This was a moment Sandra felt truly complete. Duke had not only survived everything, but he had come back to life in love. He was no longer just a warrior. He was part of this family, and this family would always be there for him. As the sun began to dip behind the clouds, Sandra sat quietly, listening to the wind rustling through the branches, feeling the stillness and peace in her heart. Duke had completed his mission, and now he was living the rest of his days in love, in a home that was truly home. He was no longer an old, frail dog, a retired warrior, but a friend, a hero of the family. Sandra looked at Duke, feeling the love in his eyes, and she knew that he would never have to fight alone again. Duke had found a place to return to, and this would be the place where he could rest, loved until his final moments. The story of Duke, also known as K9 Shadow, is a deeply moving journey of loyalty, sacrifice, and unconditional love. From a brave warrior, he faced countless trials and finally found a place to return. A place where he was not only honored but also lived in love and respect for the remainder of his life. What do you think of Duke's journey? Have you ever witnessed a friendship so strong between a human and an animal? Share your thoughts in the comments below this video. If this story has touched your heart, don't forget to like, share it with friends, and subscribe to the channel to not miss future touching stories about animal love. Thank you for watching and supporting.